For centuries, the stories of the Knights Templar have fascinated historians, scholars, and dreamers alike. Tales of wealth beyond imagination, secret rituals, and daring crusades have painted them as the ultimate warriors of faith, their legends surviving the fires of history, even as their order was violently dismantled. Yet hidden in the shadows of this grand narrative lies a chapter that history has almost entirely forgotten. A chapter that whispers of women, often erased from records, who moved through the same sacred corridors, bore the same burdens of secrecy, and may have held the keys to knowledge that even the most powerful men of the order could not possess. These were not mere bystanders or passive witnesses. These were women who, in many ways, shaped the Templar legacy itself. Their stories do not appear in the illuminated manuscripts that line the halls of libraries, nor in the chronicles of kings and chroniclers who documented the rise and fall of the order. Instead, they linger in cryptic references, obscure letters, and the subtle symbolism embedded in Templar artifacts, messages meant to survive the centuries for those daring enough to read between the lines. Imagine a world where these women walked silently through cloisters and strongholds, their presence deliberately hidden, their contributions quietly monumental. Imagine the whispered knowledge they carried, rituals, sacred bloodlines, and secrets that could alter the understanding of the Templar legacy itself. History, as is commonly taught, has a way of favoring the visible, the documented, the recognized. It tends to elevate the knights in their armor and the grand strategies of their leaders, but it is far less interested in the invisible threads that hold the tapestry together. Women were those threads, and though time has tried to erase them, subtle traces remain. Traces that hint at a network of influence, wisdom, and power that rivaled, and perhaps even guided, the male knight's actions in ways the world is only beginning to understand. Consider the paradox of the Templar order, sworn to secrecy, devoted to a higher purpose, yet destroyed in a wave of political and religious purges. Men were executed, imprisoned, and vilified. Yet, what of the women who were intertwined with their fates, who safeguarded families, hidden texts, and sacred objects, who fled persecution only to preserve the teachings and treasures that history now barely remembers? These questions are rarely asked, yet the very absence of evidence becomes a whisper, a shadow pointing toward truths deliberately concealed. As we begin this journey into the hidden lives of Templar women, it is important to set aside what we think we know. This is not a tale of knights in shining armor or simple medieval heroics. This is a story of survival, of guardianship, and of a clandestine lineage of knowledge that has echoed through centuries. It is a story told in the silence of convent walls, in cryptic letters that survived burning, in artifacts buried beneath the earth, and in whispers passed down through families who never spoke openly of their ancestry. Some of the most compelling evidence comes not from official records, but from the places where official scrutiny could not reach. Remote villages, forgotten chapels, and hidden chambers hold carvings, inscriptions, and iconography that hint at female involvement in rituals once thought exclusively male. Even the architecture of certain Templar sites, meticulously designed for secrecy and spiritual symbolism, may contain subtle markers of a feminine hand or influence, deliberate, hidden, and waiting for those who know how to see. It is here, at the intersection of history, mystery, and speculation, that the story of Templar women begins to emerge. These were women of courage, intellect, and devotion, often operating in the margins of an order that denied them visibility, yet could not exist without their influence. Their lives were dangerous, their actions covert, and their legacies, though hidden, endure in ways more profound than the chronicles of battles and treasures. Tonight, we will trace their footsteps, decode the messages they left behind, and uncover the forgotten lineage that history tried to erase. We will explore the rituals, the bloodlines, and the hidden networks that suggest a world within the world of the Templars, a realm where women were not just participants, but custodians of sacred knowledge that could alter the very story of the order itself. And as the candlelight flickers over manuscripts and tombs, as shadows fall across ancient stone, the whispers of these women begin to speak, inviting us to look beyond the surface, to see the Templars not only as warriors, but as part of a hidden, forgotten legacy that history has only partially revealed. In the silence that follows, in the stillness of forgotten corridors, the journey begins, not with men in armor, but with women whose courage and secrecy may have shaped the destiny of one of history's most enigmatic orders. And so, with curiosity as our guide, we step into the shadows, ready to uncover the stories that time tried to conceal, ready to reveal the hidden bloodlines and forgotten legacies of Templar women. The story of the Knights Templar, as most people know it, begins in the chaos and fervor of the Crusades. In the early 12th century, Europe was a land of restless ambition and religious zeal. Pilgrims traveled across treacherous terrain to reach the holy sites of Jerusalem, often falling victim to bandits, disease, or political conflict. It was in this world of peril that a small group of knights emerged, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet driven by a mission that went far beyond mere protection of pilgrims. They were the early Templars, an order that would rise to wealth, power, and a reputation so fearsome that kings and popes alike would both fear and rely upon them. But to understand the Templars fully, one must look beyond the armor, the banners, and the battlefield strategies. Their rise was as much a spiritual and organizational feat as it was a military one. They created a network of fortified strongholds, safe houses, and treasuries across Europe and the Holy Land, establishing a system that was unprecedented in scale and sophistication. They became bankers before banks were common, and administrators of lands whose value rivaled kingdoms. Their influence spread not only through swords but through gold, contracts, and subtle political maneuvering. The image of the Templar as a knight on horseback, lance poised, is only one half of the story. The other half is a complex web of logistics, diplomacy, and clandestine knowledge, much of which would later intersect with the hidden roles of women in ways history has almost entirely overlooked. Even in the earliest days of the order, there were hints that the Templars were more than a simple brotherhood of warriors. Manuscripts from the period occasionally mention supporters and helpers, though the language is deliberately vague. Many of these references point to women who provided essential support, whether through managing estates, preserving secret knowledge, or participating in spiritual practices that the men could not fully engage with while on campaign. Noblewomen, daughters of influential families, and even some who may have been initiated into clandestine rites were quietly integrated into the Templar network, their contributions carefully hidden in official records. As the Templars grew in power, their reputation began to take on a mythical quality. Tales of their bravery and discipline spread far and wide, creating a mystique that still captivates imaginations today. Yet alongside these heroic narratives, there existed a darker, more mysterious side. There were rumors of secret ceremonies conducted at night, cryptic symbols carved into stones and walls, and knowledge passed down only to the select few who had proven themselves trustworthy. While male knights were the visible agents of these secrets, women often served as custodians of the hidden, ensuring that sacred knowledge survived even in the chaos of war, conquest, and political intrigue. The contrast between what history records and what may have quietly existed is striking. Official chronicles celebrate battles and victories, the wealth of the order, and its dramatic downfall. But they're silent about the networks of women who may have been equally critical to the Templar success. Some historians speculate that women operated in the shadows to manage estates, transmit coded knowledge, and even influenced the spiritual direction of the order. Whether through nurturing connections with influential families, preserving sacred texts, or subtly guiding the moral compass of the knights themselves, these women were the hidden architects behind much of what the Templars achieved. It is easy to imagine a Templar stronghold in the Holy Land or in the heart of France, stone walls echoing with the clatter of armor and the whispers of secret knowledge. Inside, while knights trained and strategized, women moved quietly through corridors and chambers, safeguarding treasures, copying manuscripts, and performing rituals that were never meant for public eyes. They understood the delicate balance between power and secrecy, and they used that understanding to protect both lives and legacies. In this way, the Templars were not only an order of men, they were part of a larger, often invisible system in which women played indispensable roles, even if history has largely ignored them. The rise of the Templars also intersected with the ambitions of European royalty, the Church, and emerging political structures. Kings relied on the order for military support and financial management, while popes depended on them to protect pilgrims and consolidate influence in the Holy Land. Within this intricate web of power, women often acted as intermediaries, messengers, and guardians of information. Their influence, though indirect, could shift the balance of negotiations, protect estates, and ensure continuity during times of upheaval. In essence, the Templar Order may have owed as much of its endurance to these unseen women as it did to the knights who charged into battle. Yet the full extent of female involvement was carefully erased or minimized in surviving records. The Order's downfall in 1307, orchestrated by King Philip IV of France and sanctioned by the papacy, targeted male knights, seizing their wealth and condemning them to brutal executions. But what became of the women intertwined with these fates? How many escaped, carrying with them secret treasures, documents, and knowledge? How many continued the work of the Templars in ways that left no trace in the annals of history? These questions remain largely unanswered, yet they form the heart of the hidden story we are about to explore. As we continue, it becomes clear that the story of the Templars is incomplete without acknowledging these women. Their lives, their sacrifices, and their cunning strategies for survival are essential threads in the larger tapestry of Templar history. The rise of the Order was not merely a tale of male heroism. It was a story of interwoven networks, spiritual guardianship, and hidden influence. Much of it orchestrated by women who, though largely forgotten, may have been just as pivotal as the knights themselves. To follow this path is to step beyond familiar legends, to look into the shadows of medieval history, and to discover a world where the hidden power of women shaped one of the most enigmatic orders in history. To understand the hidden world of Templar women, it is essential to examine the broader context of women in medieval society, particularly in religious and mystical circles. The Middle Ages are often portrayed as a time when women had little influence, their roles confined to domestic chores, childbearing, and supporting men in the public sphere. Yet beneath this simplified narrative lies a far more complex reality. Women wielded influence in subtle, often unrecorded ways, shaping spiritual, social, and even political landscapes while navigating a society that sought to constrain them. They were mystics, scholars, healers, and keepers of sacred knowledge, operating in spaces both visible and hidden. Religious institutions were one of the few avenues through which women could exercise a degree of authority. Convents were not merely places of devotion. They were centers of learning, literacy, and artistic expression. Many nuns were trained in reading and writing, preserving manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost to time. They copied religious texts, studied ancient languages, and engaged in philosophical and theological reflection. Some convents became renowned for their intellectual rigor and spiritual insight, and women within them developed networks of correspondence and influence that reached across kingdoms. In these settings, women learned to navigate secrecy, discretion, and ritual practice, skills that would later intersect with the clandestine activities of Templar women. Beyond the walls of convents, noblewomen often played equally strategic roles. They managed vast estates, mediated disputes, and maintained alliances through marriage and diplomacy. In a world where direct participation in military or political campaigns was limited for women, influence was exercised through information, relationships, and the careful preservation of knowledge. These women understood the value of secrecy. Letters were coded, manuscripts were hidden, and certain knowledge was passed down through oral tradition or private instruction. The skills they honed, administration, discretion, and subtle negotiation, were remarkably similar to the skills required to safeguard Templar secrets, suggesting a natural alignment between the two spheres. Mysticism and esoteric practice also offered women a form of agency often overlooked by mainstream history. Women were involved in the study and application of healing herbs, alchemy, astrology, and sacred geometry, often under the veil of religion. Many of these practices were intertwined with Christian mysticism, yet they were also influenced by older, pagan traditions and localized spiritual practices. It is not difficult to imagine that Templar women, if involved in esoteric or spiritual instruction, would have been among the most educated and capable custodians of sacred knowledge. Their wisdom may have extended far beyond conventional religious instruction, encompassing secret rituals, symbolic literacy, and spiritual guidance that even male Templars might not have fully understood. This is not to romanticize their position. Women in these circles faced enormous danger. The Inquisition, social stigma, and the ever-present scrutiny of patriarchal authority meant that any deviation from the sanctioned roles could result in punishment or death. Yet, it is precisely this environment of danger and secrecy that may have honed their abilities to safeguard knowledge and navigate complex networks without attracting attention. The very necessity of concealment, the skill of operating in plain sight, became a survival mechanism that also ensured the continuity of esoteric wisdom. There are tantalizing hints in historical records that women may have been directly connected to the Templars' spiritual and mystical practices. References to supporters, helpers, or associates of the order appear in charters, letters, and marginalia, often dismissed as vague or inconsequential. However, when examined closely, these references suggest roles that went beyond mere service or domestic labor. Women may have been responsible for copying sacred texts, performing rituals, safeguarding relics, or even instructing the male knights in mystical traditions they were sworn to protect. In essence, these women were the invisible scaffolding upon which the visible edifice of the Templars was built. Consider also the symbolic significance of femininity in esoteric thought. Across many mystical traditions, the feminine represents receptivity, preservation, and hidden power. In an order obsessed with secrecy and sacred knowledge, the symbolic and practical value of women would have been immense. Female Templars or affiliates may have been entrusted with the most delicate and dangerous tasks precisely because their roles were underestimated by those outside the inner circle. By moving unseen and working behind the scenes, they could maintain continuity, preserve knowledge, and even subtly influence the direction of the order without attracting scrutiny. In addition, women often served as bridges between different spheres of influence. Through family ties, patronage, or correspondence, they connected knights with noble houses, monasteries, and local communities. These networks may have functioned as covert communication lines, allowing Templar women to transmit information, protect sacred objects, and coordinate strategies during times of crisis. Their work, though invisible in official chronicles, may have been critical to the order's expansion, survival, and the safeguarding of its esoteric practices. By exploring the lives of these women, a pattern begins to emerge. They were far from passive observers. They were active participants in the spiritual, intellectual, and operational networks that sustained the Templars. Their influence was subtle yet profound, often hidden from the public eye, but critical to the order's endurance. In understanding the broader roles of women in medieval religious and mystical spheres, we begin to see how the Templars' female affiliates were perfectly positioned to become custodians of knowledge, guardians of bloodlines, and silent architects of a legacy that history has barely begun to acknowledge. As we delve deeper, the seemingly invisible threads that connect Templar women to secret rituals, sacred bloodlines, and the hidden infrastructure of the order begin to reveal themselves. What emerges is not just a story of knights and battles, but a complex narrative in which women, operating in the shadows, safeguarded wisdom that was far more powerful than mere military might. These were women whose influence, though deliberately obscured, may hold the key to understanding the Templars in their fullest, most enigmatic form. As the shadows of history begin to lift, a more controversial and enigmatic aspect of the Templars comes into focus: the question of bloodlines, particularly those preserved, protected, or influenced by women. For centuries, scholars and mystics alike have speculated that the Templars were more than a military and religious order. Some theorists suggest they were custodians of something far more profound, a lineage of sacred knowledge, esoteric wisdom, and perhaps even a bloodline of immense significance. The women associated with the order, often erased from mainstream chronicles, may have been the true keepers of this legacy. Their role, subtle yet indispensable, challenges everything we think we know about the Templars. In medieval Europe, the concept of bloodlines was inseparable from notions of power, inheritance, and spiritual authority. Noble families guarded their lineage with meticulous care, and in many cases, women were central to the continuity of these lines. They were not merely bearers of heirs. They were transmitters of culture, knowledge, and in some esoteric traditions, sacred secrets. When we consider the Templars' connections to noble families across France, England, Portugal, and beyond, it becomes clear that women may have played a deliberate role in preserving both influence and hidden knowledge. The possibility that Templar women carried, protected, and perhaps even directed these bloodlines is both tantalizing and unsettling, for it suggests a level of agency long denied to them by historical narratives. Some historians have speculated that these women may have been involved in orchestrating marriages, securing alliances, or even determining the future direction of Templar holdings, all while keeping the order's most sensitive secrets intact. They may have acted as intermediaries between families, ensuring that sacred or esoteric knowledge was passed down to the next generation, carefully shielded from the scrutiny of both church authorities and political rivals. In this light, bloodlines were not simply a matter of inheritance. They were a living repository of knowledge, encoded in the very people who carried them. The idea of hidden or sacred bloodlines also intersects with the mythology of the Holy Grail, a symbol long associated with both the Templars and esoteric traditions. While popular culture often depicts the Grail as a physical cup or chalice, historical speculation and mystic writings suggest it may represent something far deeper: a lineage, a spiritual inheritance, a form of wisdom passed from one generation to the next. Women, as the bearers of life and the natural conduits of familial continuity, may have been entrusted with the Grail's secret in ways that men were not. By safeguarding these bloodlines, they ensured that the esoteric knowledge of the Templars survived centuries of persecution and suppression. Consider, for a moment, the deliberate destruction of the Templars in 1307. Male knights were rounded up, tortured, and executed, their treasures seized, their libraries burned. Yet the order's legacy did not vanish entirely. Could it be that women, less conspicuous and therefore less immediately targeted, were the ones who carried the essence of the order forward? Some scholars argue that clandestine female networks ensured the survival of manuscripts, artifacts, and family lines connected to Templar wisdom. By moving quietly, often under the guise of nobility, piety, or domesticity, these women may have preserved the very elements that allowed the Templars' secrets to persist long after the men were gone. There are tantalizing, though circumstantial, hints in historical documents that suggest these hidden bloodlines were deliberately maintained. Certain noble families, especially those with ties to the Crusades or to monastic institutions, appear to have been entrusted with esoteric knowledge or sacred relics. Marriages and alliances may have been orchestrated with precision, ensuring that key knowledge remained within trusted lineages. Women, by virtue of their roles as wives, mothers, and educators, were central to this strategy. The more we examine these patterns, the more it appears that the Templar Order was not merely a male-dominated hierarchy, but a complex system in which women manage continuity, memory, and secret inheritance. This hidden network of bloodlines also raises questions about identity and secrecy. Women who carried Templar knowledge may have disguised their roles entirely, integrating into mainstream society while secretly preserving the Order's most guarded wisdom. Their contributions could have been encoded in letters, prayers, and domestic rituals, leaving a legacy that was simultaneously present and invisible. In essence, history has not so much lost these women as it has deliberately obscured their significance, leaving tantalizing traces for the observant to decode. Some esoteric scholars go even further, suggesting that these bloodlines may have intertwined with mystical traditions outside the Order itself. Connections between Templar women and mystical sects, prophetic lineages, or even ancient pagan traditions have been proposed, though evidence is fragmentary and often veiled in allegory. Yet the very presence of these hints suggests a continuity of influence that cannot be dismissed entirely. Women may have been the secret custodians of a spiritual legacy, one that extended far beyond the immediate objectives of the Templars and into a broader tapestry of European mystical knowledge. It is also worth noting that bloodlines are not only about heritage, but about survival. By preserving children, manuscripts, and sacred objects, women ensured that the knowledge and influence of the Templars could survive political purges, religious inquisitions, and social upheavals. While knights fell on battlefields or at the hands of persecutors, women acted as stewards, guiding the Order's unseen continuity. They were archivists, guardians, and strategists, all while remaining invisible to the chroniclers of history. Ultimately, the story of Templar bloodlines challenges our perception of power. It asks us to consider influence not only in terms of visibility and conquest, but in the quiet, persistent preservation of knowledge and legacy. Women, through their roles in family, society, and esoteric practice, may have been the hidden architects of the Order's survival. They connected generations, maintained secret wisdom, and ensured that the Templar story did not end with the execution of its knights. As we move deeper into the hidden history of the Templars, it becomes increasingly clear that to understand the Order fully, one must consider these bloodlines and the women who protected them, not as footnotes, but as central threads in the tapestry of history. Their lives, their foresight, and their courage may have shaped the Templar legacy far more profoundly than any chronicle of battles, treasures, or grand strategy could ever reveal. The very idea of initiation within the Templar Order carries an aura of mystery and ritualized secrecy, but when we consider the possibility of women's involvement, this mystique deepens in ways that mainstream history barely acknowledges. Historical records describe the ceremonies for male knights in careful, if limited, detail. Oaths of obedience, secrecy, and martial dedication, often carried out in candlelit chapels with ritualistic precision. What is less discussed, however, is the parallel, almost invisible system that may have existed for women. These were women who were not merely supporting figures, but participants in initiatory practices, custodians of sacred rites, and guardians of esoteric knowledge. Their existence is suggested not through overt documentation, but through cryptic references, symbolic inscriptions, and patterns that emerge when we scrutinize the remnants of Templar culture. Initiation, in its essence, is a transformation. It is a passage from the ordinary into the extraordinary, a shift in consciousness and responsibility. For women associated with the Templars, initiation may have taken a different form than for the Knights, yet it was no less consequential. While male rituals emphasized martial discipline and obedience, female initiations may have focused on spiritual insight, preservation of sacred knowledge, and the mastery of secret languages or codes. In some cases, women may have been taught the symbolic meanings embedded in Templar architecture, the hidden significance of manuscripts, or even the subtle energies that the order's mystics believe flowed through the land and its relics. This knowledge, carefully guarded, could be passed to future generations or employed in times of crisis to protect the order's most treasured secrets. Evidence for these hidden initiations is scattered and often indirect, but it is suggestive. Marginal notes in manuscripts, unusual iconography in churches and Templar sites, and obscure references in legal documents hint at the existence of female participants in spiritual or mystical practices linked to the order. Some scholars point to the prevalence of feminine symbolism, lilies, veils, crescents, interwoven with Templar imagery as more than decorative elements, suggesting encoded recognition of women's roles in sacred practices. Others argue that clandestine networks of women may have had their own hierarchy, initiation rites, and systems of knowledge, functioning in parallel with the male order while remaining invisible to it. Consider the implications of such a system. Women operating within a secretive Templar framework would have wielded significant influence, precisely because their presence was hidden and underestimated. They could maintain continuity, safeguard sacred objects, and transmit esoteric wisdom without attracting the attention of kings, popes, or inquisitors. Their contributions would have been invisible to the chroniclers of the time, yet essential to the survival of the order's knowledge and bloodlines. In essence, the very secrecy that was imposed upon them by a patriarchal society may have become their greatest strength, allowing them to operate as custodians of a legacy that history has largely forgotten. The erasure of women from official records makes the task of reconstructing their roles both challenging and fascinating. We are left to read between the lines, to decipher clues hidden in architecture, art, and literature. For example, certain Templar churches and chapels display features that some researchers interpret as coded references to female initiates, hidden chambers, symbolic carvings, and spatial alignments that correspond to esoteric teachings. Manuscripts, too, contain marginalia and cryptic notes that may have served as instruction manuals or mnemonic devices for women entrusted with maintaining knowledge that could not safely be recorded openly. These hidden initiations also suggest a level of sophistication and organization previously unrecognized. The women who participated in these rites were not passive or peripheral. They were active participants in a carefully constructed system of knowledge transmission. They may have been responsible for teaching younger women, instructing select men, or maintaining ritual practices that reinforced the spiritual and mystical framework of the order. Their role was both protective and generative. They preserved what was sacred while ensuring that the next generation could inherit the same understanding. It is important to consider the psychological and social dimensions of these hidden systems. Women engaged in secret initiation would have needed extraordinary courage, intelligence, and discretion. Their knowledge made them invaluable, but also placed them at risk. Any lapse in secrecy could have led to persecution, social ostracism, or worse. Yet, for centuries, they navigated these dangers with remarkable skill, creating networks that were resilient, adaptive, and deeply loyal to the order's core principles. Their very invisibility became a tool of power, allowing them to act in ways that male contemporaries could not even imagine. In many ways, these secret female initiations represent a parallel history, a story that existed alongside the well-documented narrative of knights and battles, yet was almost entirely erased by time and patriarchy. The more we uncover about them, the more we see a pattern. Women were not only participants in the spiritual and mystical life of the Templars, but they may have been a lifeline through which sacred knowledge and bloodlines were preserved. They were custodians, strategists, and mystics, operating in a realm that remained largely invisible to those outside their circle, and perhaps even to those inside it. As we continue to explore this hidden world, it becomes increasingly clear that understanding the Templars requires acknowledging these women, not as footnotes, but as central figures in a complex and highly secretive system of knowledge, ritual, and preservation. Their initiations, though hidden, were not trivial. They were transformative, ensuring that the legacy of the Templars endured far beyond the execution of knights and the destruction of fortresses. It is within this hidden initiatory framework that the first true glimpses of the power, intelligence, and courage of Templar women begin to emerge, revealing a story of resilience, secrecy, and influence that history has barely begun to acknowledge. Among the most tantalizing mysteries surrounding the Templars are the manuscripts, letters, and codices that have survived, rare, fragile, and often deliberately hidden from the eyes of the world. These documents are not merely historical records. They are fragments of a hidden narrative, hints at the lives of women whose roles were carefully obscured by patriarchal chroniclers and the destructive forces of history. The survival of these texts, sometimes smuggled out of strongholds or buried in private collections, offers a glimpse into a world where knowledge was both sacred and dangerous, and where women may have been its most vigilant guardians. Many of the manuscripts linked to the Templars are enigmatic in nature. Some are beautifully illuminated, adorned with symbols whose meaning has been lost to time, while others are plain, their value lying in the cryptic language and coded messages concealed within. Certain texts reference the order's spiritual practices, allegorical teachings, or mystical interpretations of Scripture, information that may have been intended specifically for initiates. In several instances, women appear to have been entrusted with copying, preserving, and interpreting these works. Their literacy, which was exceptional for the time, became a form of power, allowing them to maintain the continuity of sacred knowledge even as male members of the order face persecution or death. Letters and correspondences offer another layer of evidence. While many official communications were destroyed during the 1307 purge, a few fragments remain, often hidden in unexpected places, such as monastic archives or the private collections of European nobility. These letters occasionally hint at women's involvement, sometimes as mediators, sometimes as secret keepers of knowledge, and sometimes as strategic advisors. Though the references are often subtle, the pattern is compelling. Women were not passive observers, but active participants in maintaining the Templars' networks, safeguarding documents, and ensuring that the Order's most sensitive information did not vanish entirely under political and religious assault. The destruction of Templar archives was thorough and systematic, intended to erase the Order from history. Yet, ironically, this very attempt at obliteration created conditions for secrecy that women were uniquely positioned to exploit. Manuscripts were hidden in convents, private estates, or even buried in the earth. Women, less scrutinized than their male counterparts, could transport, copy, or protect these texts with a degree of discretion unavailable to knights. Their actions were not merely practical but strategic. They ensured the survival of knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. In this sense, the preservation of manuscripts becomes more than a historical curiosity. It is evidence of a deliberate and intelligent system of secret stewardship. Some of the most intriguing manuscripts suggest that the knowledge women protected was far more than administrative or spiritual. It was esoteric, cryptic, and possibly revolutionary. Certain codices contain complex diagrams, symbolic alphabets, and allegorical narratives that may encode teachings on sacred geometry, mystical bloodlines, or hidden rituals. It is tempting to speculate that these texts were intended for female initiates, individuals trained to interpret their deeper meanings and to pass them along selectively. The very obscurity of these works indicates the high value placed on secrecy, and it is precisely within this secrecy that the influence of women becomes visible. The contrast between surviving male and female Templar documents is striking. Whereas male-focused records often emphasize military campaigns, financial transactions, or political maneuvering, manuscripts associated with women, or preserved by women, tend to focus on spiritual insight, continuity, and the preservation of hidden knowledge. This suggests a dual system, one public, visible, and martial, the other clandestine, symbolic, and intellectual. In the hidden system, women operated as archivists, educators, and interpreters, preserving not just information, but a worldview and a methodology that could outlast centuries of persecution. Codices and letters also hint at networks extending across Europe. Women appear to have maintained correspondence with each other, passing along instructions, spiritual guidance, or coded warnings. These exchanges, often veiled in metaphor or allegory, indicate that female Templars may have functioned as nodes in a covert communication network, preserving cohesion and transmitting knowledge when official channels were compromised. It is this network that allowed Templar wisdom to survive despite the violent purges that sought to eradicate the order entirely. Even when manuscripts were lost or destroyed, traces remained in oral tradition and subtle ceremonial practice. Women were often the transmitters of mnemonic techniques, ritual patterns, and interpretive knowledge that could not be written openly for fear of discovery. In this way, manuscripts served both as repositories and as teaching tools, while women acted as living archives, capable of safeguarding knowledge without leaving easily traceable evidence. Their contribution was both tangible and intangible, ensuring continuity in a way that no official record could. The survival of these documents raises questions about what has yet to be discovered. How many codices remain hidden in private collections, monasteries, or secret chambers? How many letters are tucked away in forgotten corners of Europe, waiting to reveal the next piece of the puzzle? The tantalizing possibility is that women, through centuries of careful stewardship, may have preserved a body of knowledge far richer and more influential than the world has yet acknowledged. Each manuscript that emerges from obscurity offers a glimpse of their agency, their intellect, and their courage. Ultimately, the lost and hidden manuscripts are more than relics of a vanished order. They are evidence of a hidden lineage, a network of women whose intelligence, discretion, and devotion ensured that the Templar legacy could endure. Through these texts, we begin to see a pattern emerge. The Templar story was never purely male, and the preservation of their knowledge depended as much on the unseen efforts of women as on the visible actions of knights in armor. The manuscripts, in their fragility and secrecy, serve as both a window and a mirror, showing us what was lost, what was hidden, and the enduring power of those who operated in silence. In examining these rare and often enigmatic texts, one cannot help but feel a sense of wonder and curiosity. The very survival of these manuscripts, against the odds of persecution, destruction, and neglect, points to an extraordinary resilience. Women, as silent custodians, ensured that knowledge survived not through force, but through strategy, intellect, and unwavering commitment. And it is through this preservation that the hidden story of Templar women begins to come into focus, revealing a layer of history that has been intentionally obscured, yet persists quietly, waiting to be understood. Few symbols in history have inspired as much fascination, speculation, and mystery as the Holy Grail. Popular imagination often reduces it to a physical chalice, a vessel of miraculous power sought by knights and adventurers. But when viewed through the lens of esoteric tradition and hidden Templar practices, the Grail may represent something far more profound: a lineage, a sacred bloodline, and knowledge preserved through secret guardianship. And at the heart of this mystery, women may have played a far more critical role than is commonly acknowledged. The Grail, in its symbolic and mystical interpretations, is often associated with the feminine. Across various traditions, the vessel is not merely a cup, but a metaphor for receptivity, life-giving power, and preservation of sacred wisdom. It embodies continuity, protection, and the hidden transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. Within the Templar framework, these qualities would have aligned naturally with the roles of women. If the Grail is considered a symbol of lineage, blood, and spiritual inheritance, then women were not only carriers of this legacy, but the very keepers of its secrets, responsible for ensuring that sacred wisdom endured in the face of persecution and oblivion. The connection between Templar women and the Grail is hinted at in numerous texts, some cryptic, others more overt. Manuscripts preserved in secret archives, often hidden in monasteries or private collections, suggest that certain women were initiated into esoteric rituals designed to protect and transmit Grail knowledge. These rituals were not merely ceremonial. They were instructional, teaching women how to safeguard sacred bloodlines, interpret symbolic texts, and maintain the spiritual integrity of the order. In a sense, women became living vessels themselves, embodying the Grail's principles through their guardianship and action. Consider the imagery often associated with Templar sites: churches, chapels, and castles adorned with symbolic carvings, geometric patterns, and feminine motifs. While mainstream interpretations attribute these symbols to aesthetic or religious convention, some scholars argue that they encode deeper meanings, messages intended for initiates who understood the significance of women as custodians of sacred knowledge. From lily motifs to crescent moons, these symbols may indicate networks of female instruction and protection, subtle but deliberate acknowledgments of the power women held within the order's secretive structures. The intertwining of bloodlines and sacred knowledge becomes even more compelling when considering the possibility that the Grail itself may have been a code for a living lineage rather than a static object. In this view, the Grail represents continuity through generations, maintained by women who could safeguard it from the destructive forces of politics, war, and religious persecution. Men, for all their valor and martial prowess, were vulnerable to arrest, execution, or exile. Women, often underestimated and operating in plain sight, were uniquely positioned to ensure that knowledge, spiritual authority, and even sacred genetic or symbolic inheritance survived the tumultuous events that decimated the order. There are tantalizing hints in Templar-related texts and folklore that women were intimately involved in these traditions. Some sources describe female figures who acted as mentors, ritual guides, or secret keepers, passing along knowledge only to those deemed worthy. Others suggest that women may have been entrusted with the most sacred objects or manuscripts, carrying them across borders and through centuries of political upheaval. These women, operating behind the veil of invisibility, ensured that the Grail's mysteries were neither lost nor profaned, preserving a lineage that could outlast the fall of the Templar Order itself. The esoteric knowledge women may have preserved extended beyond spiritual ritual into practical strategies for survival and concealment. They were likely adept in coded communication, symbolic writing, and the cryptic transmission of information, skills essential for the protection of sacred objects and manuscripts. These practices, though subtle, were highly sophisticated. In many ways, women functioned as both archivists and protectors, maintaining the continuity of Templar secrets when the male hierarchy was under attack. Their influence, though invisible to the chroniclers of history, was essential for the survival of the order's most profound teachings. Another aspect to consider is the intersection of prophecy and female guardianship. Some mystical traditions suggest that women were foreseen as protectors of sacred bloodlines or spiritual knowledge, charged with ensuring continuity until the time was right for revelation. Within Templar circles, this may have translated into discreet mentorship, hidden instruction, and the careful preservation of ceremonial practice. The foresight and strategic intelligence required to carry out these duties would have demanded extraordinary skill, discretion, and courage, qualities that historical records rarely attribute to women, yet which their actions imply in abundance. The very idea that the Grail was not merely an object, but a living legacy transforms our understanding of Templar history. It suggests that the most important guardians of the order were not always the knights in shining armor, but the women who safeguarded knowledge, lineage, and ritual practice. Without their involvement, the esoteric wisdom of the order could have vanished entirely after the suppression of the Templars in the early 14th century. Instead, thanks to these hidden figures, fragments of the Grail's mystery survived, encoded in manuscripts, rituals, and bloodlines, waiting to be rediscovered by those who seek to understand the hidden truth. The symbolic resonance of this legacy extends into modern interpretations as well. Contemporary speculation about secret societies, hidden bloodlines, and esoteric traditions often traces threads back to the Templars, hinting that women may have been the original conduits for this knowledge. From medieval Europe to modern mystic circles, the possibility of an unbroken chain of female guardianship transforms the narrative from one of male heroism alone into a complex tapestry of collaboration, secrecy, and continuity. Women, once hidden in the shadows of history, emerge as central figures in the preservation of knowledge that shaped not only the Templar order, but the broader mystical heritage of Europe. Ultimately, the connection between Templar women and the Grail challenges conventional assumptions. It forces us to consider power not only in terms of military strength or political influence, but in terms of custodianship, intellectual stewardship, and the quiet, persistent work of preservation. The Grail, as a symbol of lineage and sacred knowledge, was intimately tied to the agency of women who navigated secrecy, danger, and social invisibility with extraordinary skill. Without their involvement, the Templar legacy would be far less complete, its most profound mysteries lost to the annals of time. As we move forward, the threads of these hidden connections, bloodlines, manuscripts, rituals, and women's secret initiations begin to intertwine more visibly. The story of Templar women and the Grail is not one of peripheral influence, but of central importance. By tracing their roles, we uncover a narrative of resilience, intelligence, and sacred guardianship that adds a profound new dimension to the enduring mystery of the Templars, one that has remained invisible to mainstream history for centuries, yet continues to resonate in the shadows of our collective imagination. Symbols have always held a particular kind of power. They are silent conveyors of meaning, capable of encoding knowledge across centuries, invisible to the untrained, yet unmistakable to those initiated into their secrets. Within the world of the Templars, symbolism was not decoration. It was a language, a method of transmitting esoteric knowledge and spiritual wisdom that could survive persecution, war, and the destruction of records. And once again, it appears that women were deeply involved in interpreting, preserving, and perhaps even creating this symbolic language, acting as unseen custodians of a hidden literacy that spoke to the initiated while eluding the uninitiated. Throughout Europe, Templar sites, chapels, fortresses, and convents are adorned with carvings, geometric patterns, and seemingly innocuous motifs that carry layers of meaning. The intricacy of these symbols suggests intentionality, a deliberate encoding of knowledge meant to be deciphered only by those who understood the underlying language. Some symbols appear repeatedly in contexts connected to women. Crescents, veils, floral motifs, and enigmatic inscriptions that do not appear in mainstream Templar texts. Scholars and esoteric researchers speculate that these signs were not merely ornamental, but served as markers, guides, and mnemonic devices for female initiates, a visual system for preserving rituals, bloodline knowledge, and sacred teachings that could not be openly written down. The use of symbolism was particularly effective for women operating under societal constraints. Unlike men, whose movements and writings were more visible, women could use symbolic language to communicate across distances, to encode instructions for the preservation of manuscripts, or to signal the location of hidden objects. These visual cues were subtle, embedded in architecture, art, and even domestic spaces, allowing women to act as strategic custodians without attracting suspicion. In this way, the symbols themselves became both protective and instructive, creating a hidden map of knowledge that could be read only by those initiated into the Templars' esoteric traditions. Beyond physical symbols, there are references in surviving manuscripts and letters to coded language and allegorical instruction. Certain texts, often preserved in convents or noble estates, appear to contain double meanings, layered metaphors, and riddles that suggest an intended female audience. The combination of textual subtlety and visual symbolism hints at a sophisticated network of knowledge transmission. Women were not only safeguarding the content of sacred texts, but were also trained to interpret, expand, and transmit them. Their literacy, both symbolic and practical, was a form of intellectual power that enabled them to maintain continuity across centuries of upheaval. Consider, for example, the geometric arrangements in Templar architecture. Some researchers argue that these patterns are far from accidental, reflecting sacred geometry that conveys spiritual principles, ritual instructions, or cosmological understanding. Women associated with the order may have been instructed to recognize these patterns, to understand their significance, and to ensure that the lessons encoded in stone, tile, or wood were preserved for future generations. In this sense, women functioned as interpreters and protectors of knowledge, able to read the world itself as a manuscript, where every symbol, angle, and motif carried meaning. The use of symbols extended beyond instruction to the preservation of lineage and bloodlines. Certain carvings, patterns, and even recurring motifs in manuscripts may have served as identifiers for families or lines entrusted with sacred responsibilities. Women, as bearers and transmitters of bloodlines, were uniquely positioned to understand these symbolic cues and to act upon them. Through marriage, domestic networks, and conventual instruction, they could ensure that knowledge, ritual, and sacred responsibility flowed through appropriate channels, maintaining continuity even as political and religious forces sought to dismantle the Templar Order. It is also worth noting the subtlety required for this work. Women were operating in a world that systematically undervalued their contributions, making invisibility both a necessity and a form of protection. The very act of encoding and preserving knowledge through symbols allowed them to wield influence without confrontation, to act as custodians of power in a society that denied them overt authority. Their genius lay in understanding that secrecy could be a tool, that symbols could carry not only information but protection, and that subtlety could ensure survival. Some evidence suggests that these symbolic systems were not static. Women may have adapted, refined, and expanded the language of Templar symbols over generations, responding to the changing social and political landscape. As manuscripts were copied, manuscripts lost, or fortresses destroyed, women may have modified or hidden symbols in ways that preserve their meaning for future custodians. This adaptability would have been essential for the survival of the order's knowledge, ensuring that even when overt structures were obliterated, the encoded teachings, rituals, and sacred responsibilities endured. The very persistence of these symbols across centuries, in locations as diverse as rural France, the Iberian Peninsula, and the British Isles, suggests a deliberate, organized system. It is difficult to imagine this network functioning without women at its core. They were likely the custodians who taught interpretation, ensured accuracy, and maintained secrecy. Their work was invisible, yet without it, the survival of esoteric Templar knowledge would have been impossible. In this light, the study of symbols becomes not merely an academic pursuit, but a window into a hidden world of female guardianship, strategic intellect, and spiritual continuity. The interplay of hidden symbols and female influence also raises profound questions about how we understand history. What we see in mainstream chronicles, battles, wealth, and executions, is only the surface. Beneath lies a network of coded communication, spiritual instruction, and lineage preservation, much of it facilitated and safeguarded by women. Recognizing this hidden dimension transforms our understanding of the Templars, revealing a far more intricate, subtle, and resilient order than conventional history allows. Ultimately, the symbols left behind are more than artistic flourishes. They are testimonies of resilience, intelligence, and strategy, revealing women as central figures in the preservation of sacred knowledge. Each motif, geometric pattern, and coded inscription represents a fragment of a hidden system, a secret network that survived against incredible odds. Through these symbols, we catch a glimpse of the invisible labor, foresight, and courage of Templar women, whose influence has been largely erased, but whose legacy endures, quietly guiding the mysteries we continue to uncover today. The Grail has long captured the imagination of scholars, mystics, and storytellers alike, a symbol that transcends mere legend to embody the deepest mysteries of faith, power, and hidden knowledge. Popular tales describe the Grail as a chalice of divine origin, a relic imbued with miraculous properties, capable of granting eternal life, wisdom, or unimaginable power. Yet, beneath the romanticized legends lies a far more intricate and secretive narrative, one that hints at the involvement of women in its preservation, interpretation, and transmission. While history often depicts the Templars as a male-dominated order, exclusively wielding swords and managing wealth, a growing body of evidence suggests that women may have played a subtle but pivotal role in guarding these sacred mysteries. Their stories, often erased from mainstream chronicles, are whispered in fragments, in the margins of medieval texts, in veiled references in art, and in clandestine accounts passed down through generations. Consider the symbolism embedded within Grail stories. Many myths depict the vessel not simply as an object, but as a container of life, nourishment, and continuity, a motif traditionally associated with the feminine, the womb, and the act of safeguarding life. Scholars and esoteric researchers argue that such symbolism may reflect the hidden custodianship of women, whose involvement was deliberately obscured to maintain the appearance of a male-dominated order. In this context, the Grail was not merely a relic to be sought in battle or conquest. It was a secret kept alive through knowledge, ritual, and careful transmission, possibly under the careful stewardship of women whose names were never written in the annals of history. These women may have acted as intermediaries, interpreters, or protectors of esoteric wisdom, preserving it through oral traditions, coded texts, and symbols embedded in sacred architecture and illuminated manuscripts. The connection between Templar women and the Grail emerges more clearly when examining the surviving evidence of female involvement in religious and mystical orders across Europe. While mainstream accounts emphasize the absence of women from the Templar ranks, historical records from convents, abbeys, and other religious institutions suggest that women were intimately involved in supporting spiritual missions, managing estates, and safeguarding sacred objects. In some instances, women were entrusted with relics, the management of secret archives, and even the continuity of mystical traditions. Could it be that some of these women were connected to the Templars not just through bloodlines, but through shared custodianship of the Grail? Certain European families, particularly those intertwined with the nobility and ecclesiastical institutions, claim lineages that link back to both Templar men and influential women of the period. Within these bloodlines, legends persist of secret knowledge being passed along matrilineal routes, concealed from public view and preserved across centuries. Art and iconography from the medieval and early Renaissance periods provide additional clues. Across Europe, churches, cathedrals, and manuscripts reveal subtle but consistent references to women in Grail mythology. Some illuminated texts depict female figures as keepers of sacred vessels, intermediaries between divine forces and human seekers, or guides to the initiate seeking hidden truths. Architecture, too, encodes symbolism. Labyrinthine layouts, hidden chambers, and sacred geometry may have served as physical embodiments of knowledge intended for the initiated, with women playing a silent but critical role in interpreting and preserving these secrets. Every arch, every painted figure, and every marginal illustration could be a fragment of a larger narrative intentionally concealed from the broader public, hinting at the invisible hand of women in maintaining the Grail's mysteries. The Grail legend, however, is not merely a relic of the past. It is intertwined with ideas of inheritance, legacy, and hidden power. Some scholars theorize that the Grail represents a living tradition, a lineage of knowledge and influence passed through selected individuals, often women, whose discretion ensured the continuity of sacred mysteries. This theory aligns with recurring motifs of secrecy and protection, central to the Templar ethos. As the Templars faced persecution, trials, and eventual suppression, women may have carried forward these sacred responsibilities, ensuring that the knowledge, wisdom, and perhaps even physical remnants of the Grail were preserved, hidden from those who sought to destroy it. Legends speak of secret havens in remote regions, castles, monasteries, and hidden valleys, where knowledge was safeguarded and carefully transmitted. These stories suggest that women, often positioned at the margins of recorded history, were the unseen architects of continuity. By maintaining ritual practices, safeguarding sacred texts, and overseeing clandestine networks, they may have ensured that the Grail's mysteries survived through generations, eventually influencing spiritual movements, secret societies, and esoteric traditions that persisted into the modern era. In this light, the Grail is not simply a relic, but a symbol of survival, resilience, and the unacknowledged power of women working behind the veil of history. Thus, when examining Grail legends through this lens, one must question the narrative of male exclusivity. Perhaps the stories of questing knights and solitary warriors are only half the truth, while the real keepers of the Grail were women whose roles were deliberately minimized, their contributions erased or relegated to myth. These women, operating in secrecy and silence, may have shaped the course of religious, cultural, and mystical history in ways that remain largely hidden. Their presence challenges conventional histories and invites us to reconsider the Grail not as a solitary object of pursuit, but as a living tradition, a web of knowledge and influence nurtured by those whose names history forgot, but whose legacies endure in subtle, profound ways. The Grail, then, becomes more than legend. It is a story of hidden hands, invisible lineages, and the enduring strength of women who carried the weight of forbidden knowledge. Each symbol, each tale, each whispered account becomes a thread in a tapestry of secrecy resilience, and devotion. To trace the Grail is to trace the shadows of women whose impact on history has been systematically overlooked, yet whose legacy may still shape the spiritual and cultural landscape of today. As the story unfolds, the question remains, what other secrets lie encoded in the fabric of history, waiting to be revealed, and who continues to guard them in silence? Symbols are the language of secrets, a silent code woven into the fabric of history, waiting for the attentive observer to decode. For the Templars, symbols were more than decoration. They were a sophisticated method of preserving knowledge, a visual shorthand capable of conveying sacred truths to the initiated while remaining inscrutable to outsiders. Crosses, geometric patterns, numerical sequences, and hidden motifs peppered their architecture, manuscripts, and insignia. Yet among these symbols lies a subtler layer, one that hints at the presence and influence of women within an ostensibly male-dominated order. Marginal illustrations in manuscripts, hidden emblems carved into stone, and nuanced artistic flourishes suggest that women were not merely peripheral figures, but active participants in the safeguarding and transmission of Templar knowledge. Consider, for instance, the recurring motif of the vesica piscis, a shape formed by the intersection of two circles. Traditionally interpreted in Christian symbolism as a representation of Christ, life, and creation, it also resonates with feminine symbolism, representing the womb, fertility, and the generative principle. Some historians propose that its subtle inclusion in Templar seals, manuscripts, and church designs could point to women acting as custodians of sacred knowledge, embedding their presence into the very geometry of Templar symbolism. It is an invisible signature, a deliberate acknowledgement of feminine participation encoded in forms that only the initiated might recognize. Symbols like these were not merely abstract or decorative. They were protective, ensuring that critical knowledge could survive persecution, suppression, or the passage of centuries. Manuscripts provide further insight into this hidden network. Illuminated texts often include marginalia, tiny drawings, obscure figures, and cryptic annotations that appear trivial at first glance but may carry profound meaning. Some of these margins depict female figures in symbolic postures, often interacting with objects of significance, books, vessels, or architectural models. These images may have served as guides or keys, a way of encoding ritual practices, genealogical knowledge, or philosophical insights accessible only to those with the interpretive key. Women may have been the intended recipients or interpreters of these messages, the silent archivists of wisdom deliberately concealed from mainstream historical accounts. In essence, the margins of these manuscripts become a hidden dialogue between initiates, a conversation that history has largely overlooked. Templar architecture also speaks in symbols. Gothic cathedrals, chapels, and fortified structures designed or commissioned by the order are riddled with geometry, numerology, and iconography. Labyrinthine layouts, hidden stairways, and cryptic inscriptions suggest a coded environment intended to protect sacred knowledge. Some scholars argue that women, often in charge of managing estates, convents, and religious houses connected to Templars, may have understood these symbols in ways men did not, preserving the knowledge in secret. Certain carvings, subtly altered or carefully positioned, could indicate a layered meaning accessible only to those trained in esoteric interpretation. In these silent spaces, women may have functioned as intermediaries, ensuring that the knowledge survived both the collapse of the order and the scrutiny of hostile authorities. The deliberate use of coded language further reinforces this idea. Certain Templar texts and charters contain obscure phrasing, numerical codes, and symbolic references that appear arbitrary to the uninitiated but reveal hidden meanings to those who knew how to read them. Some researchers suggest that women were trained in this symbolic literacy, acting as the keepers and transmitters of coded knowledge. These codes could relate to everything from strategic plans and financial records to spiritual doctrines and mystical teachings. By embedding messages in symbols and marginalia, the Templars, and perhaps the women who worked alongside or within their orbit, created a durable and secure method for safeguarding secrets across generations, a system resilient to the pressures of persecution, loss, and suppression. The recurring theme of duality is also notable. Many symbols feature pairs, reflections, or mirrored elements, suggesting complementary forces at work. Historians and esoteric scholars have speculated that this duality represents the interaction of masculine and feminine principles, the warrior and the guardian, the visible and the hidden, the public order and the private custodian. Within this framework, women may have been the hidden complement to the male-dominated Templar order, their influence carefully encoded but omnipresent. From the subtle positioning of female figures in illuminated texts to the deliberate geometry of sacred spaces, a pattern emerges. Women were never absent. They were encrypted within the very symbols the Templars left behind. Even heraldry offers tantalizing hints. Coats of arms, crests, and family seals occasionally feature symbols traditionally associated with women, including specific floral motifs, vessels, and animals linked to fertility, protection, and wisdom. These symbols were often inherited matrilineally or carefully incorporated to honor female influence within noble or Templar-connected families. Such heraldic codes may have served as a discreet acknowledgement of women's roles in preserving and transmitting knowledge, signaling their participation without drawing the scrutiny of external authorities. Moreover, these symbols often transcend their original time and place. Researchers tracing esoteric traditions through European history have noted their recurrence in later secret societies, mystical movements, and even Renaissance art. The enduring presence of these symbols suggests that the women who encoded and interpreted them successfully ensured their survival, influencing spiritual and cultural traditions long after the dissolution of the Templars. This continuity challenges the narrative that women were passive or marginal, instead positioning them as active participants in the creation, interpretation, and transmission of hidden knowledge across centuries. Ultimately, Templar symbols functioned as a silent but powerful network, a language of secrecy and survival. They reveal a world in which knowledge was protected, transmitted, and understood only by those initiated into its mysteries. Women, operating behind the veil of mainstream history, emerge as central figures in this system. Whether through marginalia, architectural geometry, heraldic emblems, or coded texts, their presence is felt in every line, curve, and motif. Symbols were their medium, the subtle way in which they preserved sacred knowledge, bloodline wisdom, and esoteric traditions that might otherwise have been lost to time. As we study these symbols today, we are not merely uncovering decorative or aesthetic choices. We are tracing the hidden fingerprints of women whose contributions history has often ignored. Each carved figure, each geometric alignment, each coded annotation is a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and guardianship. By decoding these symbols, modern researchers and seekers can glimpse the invisible network of knowledge and power maintained by Templar women, an enduring legacy quietly shaping the hidden currents of history. In this silent, symbolic language, the past speaks to us, whispering secrets of guardianship, loyalty, and the hidden hand of women who ensured that the Order's deepest mysteries would not vanish, but endure, waiting for those perceptive enough to see and understand. The story of the Templars did not end with the sudden arrests, trials, and dissolution that shook medieval Europe. While their official order was erased from records and their wealth seized, a hidden thread persisted, carried quietly across centuries. This was not merely a legacy of men and their deeds on the battlefield or in the corridors of power, but a subtler, more enduring legacy preserved through bloodlines, often maternal, and through women whose roles have been systematically overlooked. These women, whether as daughters, wives, or clandestine associates of the Templars, may have carried forward knowledge, traditions, and influence that survived the Order's apparent destruction. The notion of a secret continuity is not fanciful. It emerges from the careful study of genealogies, family alliances, and the patterns of inheritance that suggest hidden guardianship of a legacy meant to endure beyond the reach of persecution. Across Europe, certain noble families and merchant dynasties exhibit curious anomalies in their genealogical records. In regions like France, Portugal, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula, one finds lineages with inexplicable connections to the Templars, often through female ancestors whose names do not appear in conventional chronicles. These women, situated at the intersection of aristocracy, ecclesiastical influence, and economic power, may have acted as the silent custodians of knowledge and tradition. Letters, estate records, and occasional private accounts hint at networks of communication and alliance that operated in parallel to official histories. It is within these networks that one can detect the faint traces of what could be described as a living Templar heritage, preserved not through monuments or armies, but through human continuity, vigilance, and discretion. The concept of secret continuity becomes even more compelling when one considers the nature of Templar knowledge itself. Beyond military prowess and financial acumen, the Order is believed to have preserved esoteric teachings, mystical texts, and sacred symbolism. Much of this knowledge, it seems, was encoded, hidden, or transmitted orally, designed to survive only if passed carefully from one trusted individual to another. Women, often excluded from formal recognition but intimately involved in religious, social, and economic spheres, could have been uniquely positioned to fulfill this role. Their domestic, social, and religious authority allowed them access to both the material and intellectual resources necessary to safeguard sacred knowledge. They were the archivists of the living order, ensuring continuity in a world intent on erasing it. Throughout the centuries that followed the Templar suppression, these hidden custodians may have subtly shaped events, influencing political alliances, guiding heirs, or preserving artifacts and documents of immense significance. Consider, for example, the purported involvement of noble families in the preservation of sacred relics, manuscripts, or ritual objects tied to Templar history. While such claims are often dismissed by mainstream historians, patterns emerge in regions like southern France, northern Italy, and Iberia, where the presence of women in positions of relative authority aligns with the continued survival of esoteric practices and secretive knowledge. Certain convents, estates, and hidden libraries are believed to have served as safe havens, carefully maintained by women who understood both the spiritual and practical importance of their guardianship. Oral traditions also play a vital role in this continuum. Stories passed down quietly within families or communities often hint at extraordinary knowledge or unusual lineage, sometimes framed as legend, but occasionally backed by corroborative historical evidence. These oral narratives frequently highlight female figures, grandmothers, matriarchs, or hidden relatives, whose vigilance preserved rituals, knowledge of symbols, or even the management of wealth and artifacts connected to Templar history. The emphasis on women in these narratives is significant, suggesting that while men may have wielded swords and titles, women wielded influence in subtler, quieter, but equally enduring ways. Their agency, though rarely acknowledged, may have been instrumental in sustaining the Order's legacy beyond the reach of history's erasers. Some historians have traced these lines into the Renaissance, noting how families with purported Templar connections influenced art, scholarship, and architecture. Women in these families often acted as patrons, collectors, or intermediaries, shaping cultural and intellectual currents while maintaining the secrecy necessary to protect esoteric knowledge. Their influence might have extended into religious reform, the commissioning of works imbued with coded symbolism, or the careful curation of texts that preserved knowledge deemed too dangerous or sacred for public exposure. Even today, traces of this hidden influence remain, suggesting that Templar women were not merely passive observers of history, but active architects of its enduring currents. Genealogical anomalies also suggest strategic alliances and marriages that strengthen the continuity of these bloodlines. Certain noble families, particularly in France and the Iberian Peninsula, appear to have intermarried in ways that preserved not only wealth but also esoteric traditions. These alliances may have been carefully orchestrated to ensure that the knowledge, artifacts, or ritual practices associated with the Templars remain protected. Female members of these families, entrusted with domestic and spiritual authority, would have been central to this process, guiding the transmission of knowledge, influencing heirs, and safeguarding secrets across generations. The idea of hidden Templar bloodlines challenges conventional understandings of history, suggesting a dual narrative: the public story, dominated by men and martial exploits, and a private story, sustained by women and their descendants. In this private story, knowledge is a living inheritance, preserved through human agency rather than stone or manuscript alone. It is a story of resilience, vigilance, and foresight, a deliberate effort to protect what was deemed sacred from forces seeking to annihilate it. The notion of continuity is not merely theoretical. It is supported by patterns of social behavior, genealogical evidence, and the persistence of ritual and symbolic traditions that cannot easily be explained by chance alone. By tracing these bloodlines and the women who maintain them, a new understanding of Templar legacy emerges. It is not a tale of sudden destruction followed by disappearance, but of persistence, adaptation, and survival. Knowledge, sacred objects, and ritual practice may have passed quietly from mother to daughter, from aunt to niece, or from trusted associate to chosen heir, forming an invisible chain that resisted the sweep of persecution. These women, operating in silence, ensured that the essence of the Templar order, the wisdom, the strategy, the sacred symbolism, remained intact, ready to resurface in later centuries when conditions allowed. The concept of hidden continuity also reframes our understanding of historical influence. If these bloodlines and networks were preserved, then it is plausible that women played an enduring role in shaping religious thought, cultural developments, and even political decisions throughout European history. Their agency, often hidden, challenges the narrative of male dominance and invites a reconsideration of how knowledge and power were transmitted and protected across generations. Templar women, invisible yet indispensable, emerge not as footnotes in history, but as guardians of a profound legacy whose echoes continue to reverberate through time. In the end, tracing these hidden lineages illuminates the enduring tension between secrecy and survival. While the Templars themselves were dismantled, and many of their men executed or scattered, the continuity of their knowledge, their sacred symbols, and perhaps their very ideals may have persisted through women who understood the necessity of discretion, foresight, and guardianship. They were the invisible threads holding together a tapestry of history that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Through them, the Templar Order, though ostensibly defeated, continued to live on, quietly shaping the currents of European history, esoteric knowledge, and spiritual tradition. The story of these bloodlines is a reminder that history is rarely as simple as it appears, and that often the most powerful influence is wielded not in the public eye, but in quiet vigilance, hidden away from those who seek to suppress it, yet preserved for those patient enough to uncover its traces. As the shadows of the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, Europe was transformed by an explosion of art, thought, and cultural exploration. It is within this era that the hidden legacies of Templar women may have found a subtle but profound expression. Although the Templar Order had been formally dissolved centuries earlier, its influence appears to have quietly persisted through networks of women who retained knowledge, artifacts, and esoteric traditions. These women, often operating in the margins of society, became patrons of culture, intermediaries of sacred knowledge, and quiet architects of influence. Their impact was indirect, carefully veiled, yet deeply consequential, shaping intellectual and artistic currents that still resonate today. Across France, Italy, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula, noble and affluent families were often interconnected through marriages, inheritances, and patronage networks. Within these families, women were entrusted not only with household management, but also with education, moral guidance, and the preservation of traditions. Some of these women may have been direct descendants of Templar-affiliated families or had intimate knowledge of the order's secrets. By commissioning art, supporting scholars, or guiding religious institutions, they ensured that the essence of Templar ideals, discipline, sacred knowledge, and subtle forms of power, continue to influence society, albeit in ways that avoided direct scrutiny or confrontation. Art and architecture of the Renaissance reveal traces of these hidden influences. Certain motifs in churches, palaces, and private chapels mirror the geometric and symbolic patterns associated with the Templars. Within these designs, researchers have identified references to sacred geometry, coded symbols, and allegorical representations that seem out of place in conventional Christian iconography. Many of these works were commissioned or curated by women of means, patrons who had both the resources and the insight to preserve subtle esoteric knowledge through visual culture. By embedding these symbols into tangible, enduring forms, they created a silent yet powerful mechanism for transmitting knowledge across generations, ensuring that Templar wisdom was not entirely lost, but transformed into cultural memory. Books and manuscripts, too, were essential tools in the hands of these women. While men were often the public face of scholarship and religious authority, women controlled access to education, literary production, and the transmission of knowledge within private spheres. Manuscripts may have been copied, annotated, and safeguarded by women who understood their symbolic or mystical significance. Marginalia, veiled references, and coded annotations in these texts suggest a continuity of secret knowledge, accessible only to those initiated into the esoteric tradition. By controlling these conduits of information, women functioned as custodians, ensuring that the intellectual and spiritual legacy of the Templars endured quietly within Renaissance society. The strategic placement of these women within powerful social and religious networks cannot be overlooked. Many were connected to influential monasteries, convents, or charitable institutions, which provided both cover and a platform for the preservation of sacred knowledge. In these spaces, women could practice and safeguard rituals, maintain symbolic traditions, and ensure the continuity of teachings that might otherwise have been suppressed or destroyed. This was not an overt rebellion against authority, but a deliberate, careful stewardship of knowledge. By blending in with accepted social roles, these women were able to exercise subtle influence, guiding the preservation of sacred heritage in a way that would remain invisible to historians and authorities for centuries. Political upheavals during the Renaissance further amplified the importance of discreet guardianship. Wars, shifting alliances, and the rise of centralized states created an environment in which the survival of sensitive knowledge required prudence and discretion. Women of influence often acted as intermediaries in these turbulent times, using their social positions to protect artifacts, documents, and even family members connected to Templar legacies. Their actions were necessarily quiet and strategic, leaving behind little overt evidence. Yet the long-term survival of certain families, symbols, and esoteric practices speaks to the effectiveness of their stewardship. Marriage alliances were another crucial element in this hidden continuity. Women often served as the linchpins of familial networks, connecting different houses, estates, and regions. Through marriage, women could transfer knowledge, symbols, and influence, ensuring that Templar legacies remained active in new social and political contexts. This transfer of knowledge was not always formalized in written records. Instead, it was embedded in family practices, oral traditions, and private rituals. By navigating these networks with intelligence and foresight, women became the unseen architects of continuity, ensuring that sacred wisdom persisted even as the external world changed dramatically around them. The Renaissance also witnessed the revival of classical learning, humanist philosophy, and esoteric study, providing fertile ground for the subtle reemergence of Templar knowledge. Women, often patrons or participants in these intellectual circles, may have facilitated the integration of Templar symbolism into new frameworks of understanding. Through libraries, salons, and private collections, they curated texts, artifacts, and artworks that preserve the order's spiritual and intellectual heritage. The careful selection and protection of these materials suggest a deliberate intention to sustain a hidden lineage of knowledge, a continuity that relied not on public acclaim, but on discretion, trust, and foresight. Furthermore, these women often played the role of educators, guiding the next generation in matters of ethics, spirituality, and practical wisdom. By embedding lessons in stories, rituals, and symbolic instruction, they ensured that knowledge passed from one generation to the next, often unnoticed by the broader society. Their influence was subtle yet profound, shaping minds, preserving traditions, and cultivating a culture of secrecy and reverence for the sacred. In doing so, they reinforced the endurance of Templar ideals and created an invisible network that spanned centuries. In essence, the hidden patronage of women during the Renaissance transformed Templar legacies into enduring cultural currents. Their influence was neither overt nor widely acknowledged, yet it left an indelible mark on art, architecture, scholarship, and social networks. By embedding symbols, safeguarding manuscripts, and guiding heirs, these women ensured that the essence of Templar knowledge, the discipline, the sacred wisdom, and the understanding of hidden forces, remained alive. Through their vigilance, secrecy, and strategic foresight, they became the invisible guardians of a heritage that history appeared to have extinguished. Thus, the story of the Renaissance is incomplete without acknowledging the subtle, yet enduring influence of Templar women. Behind the grand works of art, the scholarly pursuits, and the religious transformations, there existed a quiet, persistent force. Women preserving and transmitting knowledge that was considered too dangerous, too sacred, or too secret for the public eye. Their legacy is not only in what has survived materially, but in the continuity of ideas, symbols, and practices that underpin the cultural and spiritual landscape of Europe. In this hidden patronage, the Templar order lived on, sustained by women whose vigilance and wisdom ensured that the shadows of the past remained illuminated, waiting for those perceptive enough to uncover them. As Europe moved into the 17th and 18th centuries, the echoes of the Templar legacy continued to resonate, often hidden beneath layers of legend, rumor, and secrecy. The public narrative suggested that the order had vanished completely, its men executed or scattered, its treasures seized, and its knowledge lost. Yet, whispers persisted in obscure corners of Europe, stories of secretive families, concealed manuscripts, and women quietly preserving rituals, symbols, and knowledge that should have been erased from history. These stories were often dismissed as superstition or romantic myth, yet the patterns that emerge suggest something more substantial. The possibility that Templar women and their descendants maintained a hidden continuity, shaping events and knowledge in ways rarely acknowledged by mainstream historians. Across the European landscape, particularly in France, Spain, and parts of Italy, historical anomalies point to the persistence of these hidden networks. Certain noble and merchant families exhibit genealogical curiosities, ties to suppressed Templar estates, unusual inheritance practices, and the consistent presence of women who appear to act as custodians of knowledge or guardians of secret traditions. In some cases, these women were positioned within convents or private estates where they could safely maintain manuscripts, symbols, or rituals. They operated in silence, often behind the veil of acceptable societal roles, ensuring that sacred knowledge continued to exist even as the world around them evolved politically, culturally, and socially. The 17th century, in particular, saw an increase in esoteric interest and the proliferation of secret societies. Freemasonry, Rosicrucian orders, and other mystical movements began to emerge, some claiming inspiration from, or at least continuity with, Templar ideals. Researchers have noted that women occasionally appear in these circles, either as patrons, correspondents, or initiates, suggesting that the guardianship of hidden knowledge was not strictly male-dominated. These women may have acted as conduits, linking centuries-old Templar wisdom to emerging esoteric traditions. Through private instruction, mentorship, and careful curation of texts and symbols, they could transmit knowledge safely, subtly influencing intellectual and spiritual currents across generations. Oral traditions during this era offer further insight. Within certain families and communities, stories persisted of women who had safeguarded objects, manuscripts, or sacred knowledge connected to the Templars. These narratives often describe women as guides, interpreters, or keepers of secrets, entrusted with responsibilities that extended beyond ordinary domestic or social duties. In some cases, these oral accounts hint at concealed maps, coded writings, or symbolic teachings passed down quietly from mother to daughter. Though these stories rarely made it into official records, they served as a living memory, a means of continuity that allowed sacred knowledge to survive even when written evidence had been destroyed or suppressed. The 18th century brought new challenges and opportunities for these hidden custodians. Political upheaval, wars, and shifts in power meant that secrecy became even more essential. Women of influence navigated these turbulent times with prudence, safeguarding Templar artifacts, manuscripts, and symbols within private estates, convents, or social networks. Their actions were necessarily subtle. Overt preservation of Templar heritage could invite danger or destruction. Yet within the private spaces of these households, knowledge and ritual practice endured, transmitted quietly through teaching, symbolic instruction, and careful management of family archives. In this way, women acted as invisible stewards of continuity, bridging the medieval past with the intellectual and spiritual currents of the modern era. Several historical anecdotes suggest the involvement of women in preserving specific esoteric or sacred objects. Some were entrusted with sacred relics, ritual implements, or manuscripts containing symbolic codes and teachings. These women were not merely passive custodians. They were interpreters and guides, ensuring that knowledge was not only preserved but understood and transmitted with fidelity. Their involvement challenges the conventional narrative that the Templar legacy was entirely extinguished with the fall of the order. Instead, it suggests that the continuity of influence and knowledge relied on the discretion, intelligence, and vigilance of women operating in the shadows of recorded history. European folklore from this period also hints at hidden Templar influences, often encoded in local legends, festivals, and regional rituals. In some regions, women were celebrated as wise figures, midwives, or keepers of communal knowledge, roles that may have roots in their guardianship of hidden Templar traditions. The persistence of specific symbolic motifs, patterns in embroidery, architecture, or religious artifacts, supports the theory that women were embedding and transmitting esoteric knowledge within cultural practices accessible only to those initiated or attentive enough to notice. These practices allowed sacred traditions to survive in forms that were both practical and symbolic, blending seamlessly into everyday life while preserving their deeper meaning. The intertwining of female influence with secret societies and esoteric movements also suggests that women may have been central to the survival of Templar knowledge in intellectual and mystical contexts. By participating in private salons, libraries, and correspondences, women facilitated the transmission of hidden wisdom to scholars, mystics, and select initiates. They acted as bridges between the medieval guardians of sacred knowledge and the emerging networks of the Enlightenment and early modern Europe. Through mentorship, curation, and discreet patronage, these women helped to shape the intellectual and spiritual landscape, ensuring that the essence of the Templar legacy, discipline, wisdom, and symbolic understanding, persisted. Moreover, the persistence of Templar-related symbolism in European art, architecture, and literature of this period often points to deliberate preservation by women. Illuminated texts, religious iconography, and heraldic motifs occasionally include elements that are cryptic to the casual observer but resonate with the esoteric traditions associated with the order. Women, particularly those with access to private collections or the ability to commission works, may have deliberately incorporated these symbols to maintain continuity. Each preserved manuscript, each subtle symbol embedded in art, becomes evidence of their quiet yet enduring influence. By the end of the 18th century, a pattern emerges. Women, operating in the margins of recorded history, ensured that the knowledge, rituals, and symbols of the Templars survive beyond the reach of persecution and official erasure. They functioned as the hidden custodians of a legacy that was both fragile and profound, relying on secrecy, foresight, and intimate knowledge of social networks to safeguard what was deemed too sacred or dangerous for public acknowledgement. Through their vigilance, the Templar heritage became a living tradition, quietly influencing spiritual, cultural, and intellectual currents into the modern age. This hidden legacy invites us to reconsider how history has been recorded and whose stories have been emphasized or erased. While men dominated the visible narrative of the Templars, women were indispensable in ensuring the survival of knowledge and tradition. Their influence, often subtle and invisible to the chroniclers of the time, shaped the course of esoteric history in profound ways. The continuation of hidden bloodlines, preserved symbols, and clandestine rituals demonstrates that power, knowledge, and influence often operate in silence, safeguarded by those who understood that the most enduring legacies are not always the most visible. In tracing the whispered legacies of these women, we uncover a remarkable continuity, a chain of guardianship stretching across centuries, linking medieval Templar history to early modern Europe. The story of these women is a story of resilience, intelligence, and unwavering dedication. Through them, the Templar Order did not vanish. It transformed, survived, and subtly shaped the currents of history, culture, and spiritual thought in ways that continue to ripple into the present. The hidden threads of influence they maintained remind us that history is often richer, deeper, and more complex than the official record suggests, and that the women who preserved these secrets were as essential to the survival of the Templar legacy as the knights whose exploits dominate the popular imagination. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it a renewed fascination with the mystical, the esoteric, and the secretive pasts of Europe. Researchers, occultists, and spiritual seekers turned their attention to the Templars, intrigued not only by their legendary wealth and martial prowess, but also by the enigmatic threads of knowledge that seemed to have survived their official suppression. Among these investigations, a recurring theme emerged: the subtle yet persistent influence of women in preserving and transmitting Templar traditions. Although the medieval chronicles largely silenced female participation, modern research began to uncover traces of their guardianship, suggesting that the hidden legacies of Templar women endured into contemporary times. These women, whether as descendants, scholars, or spiritual intermediaries, became central figures in the revival of esoteric understanding. Occult movements of the early 20th century, particularly those influenced by Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, and Freemasonry, frequently intersected with narratives about the Templars. While men dominated the visible structures of these organizations, women often served as patrons, researchers, and intermediaries, preserving manuscripts, interpreting symbols, and participating in the clandestine networks that linked modern esoteric practices to medieval origins. Letters, private correspondences, and early scholarly publications suggest that certain women were recognized by these circles as keepers of knowledge, often acting as the bridge between historical tradition and contemporary spiritual inquiry. Their roles were quiet yet vital, ensuring that Templar influence was not only remembered, but reintegrated into the intellectual and mystical currents of the time. In the libraries, archives, and private collections of Europe, women were frequently involved in uncovering and curating manuscripts that had survived centuries of neglect or deliberate suppression. Some of these texts contained cryptic symbols, coded language, or references to rituals and philosophies associated with the Templars. By studying, cataloging, and interpreting these materials, women acted as both conservators and interpreters, preserving the intellectual continuity of an order that had officially ceased to exist. Their work often went uncredited, yet formed the backbone of much of the early 20th century understanding of esoteric and Templar-related traditions. In doing so, they ensured that the knowledge, symbols, and hidden teachings of the Templars remained accessible to those with the insight to recognize their significance. The resurgence of interest in mystical history also coincided with the rise of spiritualist movements, secret societies, and experimental schools of thought, many of which sought to reconnect with forgotten wisdom. Women were often positioned at the heart of these networks, either as participants, advisors, or facilitators. Their involvement suggests continuity with the historical patterns observed in earlier centuries, in which female guardianship of sacred knowledge was essential for its survival. By mentoring initiates, curating teachings, and maintaining secrecy, these women preserved a lineage of knowledge that intertwined medieval tradition with modern esoteric exploration. Their influence extended beyond mere scholarship. They helped shape the practical application of this knowledge in spiritual and mystical communities. Moreover, women played a crucial role in the reinterpretation and popularization of Templar history in the modern imagination. Authors, historians, and occultists of the early 20th century often drew upon oral histories, family traditions, and obscure archival materials, many of which were safeguarded by women. These contributions influenced the framing of Templar narratives in ways that mainstream scholarship had overlooked, incorporating perspectives that acknowledged, at least implicitly, the hidden influence of female custodians. By shaping the modern understanding of Templar history, these women ensured that the legacy of the order remained relevant, mysterious, and compelling, bridging the gap between historical fact, legend, and esoteric interpretation. Art, literature, and cultural production of the 20th century also bear traces of this influence. Paintings, novels, and early documentary efforts often encoded Templar symbolism, themes of hidden knowledge, and references to women as guardians of sacred mysteries. Women who were patrons, scholars, or researchers were instrumental in curating and interpreting these representations, subtly guiding the ways in which Templar history was reimagined. Through these cultural channels, the presence of women as active participants in preserving and transmitting hidden knowledge was reaffirmed, ensuring that their contributions remained alive in both scholarly and popular consciousness. Historical investigation during this period further highlighted the role of women in secret societies that claimed, or were believed to claim a connection to Templar heritage. Certain orders and lodges maintained strict records, sometimes acknowledging female participation in rituals, teaching, or custodianship. As we move into the contemporary era, the legacies of Templar women take on a new and compelling dimension. The medieval knights and their clandestine operations may belong to the distant past, but the influence of their hidden custodians, women who safeguarded knowledge, symbols, and bloodlines, continues to reverberate in unexpected ways. Across Europe and beyond, researchers, historians, and spiritual seekers have uncovered threads that suggest the persistence of these legacies into modern society, often disguised within noble families, scholarly circles, or esoteric communities. The continuity of knowledge, once carefully guarded through secrecy and discretion, now emerges in the subtle ways these women shaped cultural memory, intellectual pursuits, and spiritual inquiry. In modern Europe, the study of genealogical records and family histories reveals curious and compelling patterns. Certain families with known Templar connections, whether through male ancestors or through strategic alliances, demonstrate unusually well-preserved traditions, symbols, and archives. Women in these families have often been central to maintaining these practices, overseeing estates, collections, and private libraries where relics and manuscripts connected to Templar history were kept safe. In some cases, these women also acted as interpreters, decoding symbols, texts, and rituals that were deliberately obscured to prevent misuse or misinterpretation. Their discretion ensured that knowledge remained secure while still allowing for careful transmission across generations. Modern scholarship has also highlighted the role of women in safeguarding Templar-related artifacts and historical sites. Many castles, chapels, and private estates across France, Italy, Portugal, and Spain contain elements of Templar heritage that were preserved not by public institutions, but through private custodianship. Women often played the decisive role in this preservation, maintaining these properties, overseeing renovations, and ensuring that sacred symbols and relics were respected and protected. Without their intervention, much of the material culture of the Templars might have been lost to neglect, war, or the forces of modernization. Their actions, though subtle and often undocumented, form an essential link in the survival of Templar heritage into the modern era. The influence of Templar women also extends into contemporary spiritual and esoteric practices. Many modern mystical orders, societies, and communities trace their origins, inspiration, or methodology to Templar traditions. In these contexts, women frequently serve as initiates, teachers, and keepers of rituals and symbols, continuing the centuries-old tradition of discreet guardianship. By transmitting knowledge orally, symbolically, and through mentorship, they ensure that the Templar legacy remains a living tradition rather than a static historical artifact. This continuity demonstrates that the preservation of sacred knowledge does not rely solely on public recognition, but on the careful stewardship and active participation of those entrusted with it. Furthermore, the role of women in connecting historical Templar knowledge to modern scholarship cannot be overstated. Researchers, historians, and independent investigators often rely on family records, private collections, and oral histories, many of which have been safeguarded by women. Their meticulous preservation of documents, careful interpretation of symbols, and willingness to pass knowledge to trustworthy scholars have been pivotal in reconstructing the Templar narrative. Without these contributions, much of what is now known about the hidden networks, esoteric practices, and influential women connected to the order would remain lost, leaving only a fragmentary and distorted historical record. The symbolic impact of Templar women also endures in cultural expression. Art, literature, and media continue to reflect themes of hidden knowledge, secret bloodlines, and the interplay of power and secrecy, all motifs influenced by the persistent presence of women as custodians of legacy. Modern authors, filmmakers, and game designers, whether consciously or subconsciously, draw upon these narratives, creating works in which women are central to the preservation or revelation of hidden truths. In this sense, the legacy of Templar women extends beyond scholarly or esoteric circles, permeating the cultural imagination and reinforcing their historical significance in shaping the way society perceives the Templars. The continuation of Templar bloodlines through women also carries profound implications for understanding the transmission of influence, both socially and spiritually. While male Templar members were often publicly celebrated for their martial prowess, women maintained continuity through subtler means, guiding heirs, preserving sacred knowledge, and ensuring that familial, symbolic, and ritual legacies survive the upheavals of history. These lineages, carefully nurtured, allowed Templar traditions and principles to persist even when the order itself had been officially eradicated. In many ways, women functioned as the invisible thread connecting medieval history to the modern world, ensuring that the lessons, practices, and esoteric insights of the Templars could endure. Modern investigation into the influence of Templar women also reveals an intriguing overlap with contemporary debates about hidden knowledge and suppressed history. Scholars examining suppressed texts, coded manuscripts, and esoteric symbolism often uncover evidence that women played a crucial role in preserving what mainstream history either ignored or deliberately concealed. Their actions challenge traditional narratives of power and influence, demonstrating that authority does not always reside in visible positions or in public accolades. Instead, the most enduring forms of influence are often exercised quietly, strategically, and with foresight, a hallmark of the female custodians of the Templar legacy. In addition, women continue to act as bridges between historical Templar practices and modern applications. Whether through scholarship, mentorship, or spiritual guidance, they interpret and transmit traditions that would otherwise remain inaccessible. Their role demonstrates that the preservation of knowledge is not a passive act, but an active engagement, requiring intelligence, discernment, and courage. By maintaining these traditions, women ensure that the Templar legacy remains dynamic, capable of adapting to changing historical and cultural contexts while retaining the core principles, symbols, and insights that define the order's hidden influence. Ultimately, the story of Templar women in the modern era is a story of resilience, foresight, and enduring guardianship. Their efforts have preserved not only the tangible remnants of Templar history, but also the intangible currents of influence, symbol, and wisdom that continue to shape the cultural, spiritual, and intellectual landscape today. They remind us that history is not solely written by those in positions of visible power. It is also shaped by those who work quietly, persistently, and strategically to protect knowledge, legacy, and tradition. Their contributions underscore the idea that the survival of sacred knowledge relies as much on discretion and stewardship as it does on visibility and authority. The modern significance of Templar women also challenges our understanding of historical narrative itself. By tracing their influence, we are compelled to acknowledge that the Templar legacy is not merely a tale of knights, battles, and lost treasures, but a complex web of human agency, secrecy, and continuity, much of it maintained by women whose contributions have been overlooked for centuries. Their enduring presence demonstrates that history is layered, multifaceted, and often preserved in the quiet actions of those who understand its true value. In conclusion, the modern legacy of Templar women is both profound and far-reaching. Through discreet guardianship, intellectual stewardship, and cultural influence, they have ensured that the Templar order, its knowledge, and its symbolic power remain alive, resonant, and relevant. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of vigilance, secrecy, and resilience, reminding us that the hidden threads of history often hold the key to understanding the past, shaping the present, and guiding the future. By recognizing their contributions, we not only honor the women who preserved a centuries-old legacy, but also gain a deeper, richer understanding of the Templars themselves, a legacy that survives not only in monuments and manuscripts, but in the living continuity of those who carried it forward. The story of Templar women culminates not in a single dramatic event, but in the quiet, persistent continuation of a legacy that has survived centuries of upheaval, suppression, and erasure. By the time we reach the modern era, it becomes clear that the influence of these women was not a peripheral footnote, but a central thread in the enduring narrative of the Templars. Their contributions, hidden, discreet, and often invisible to history's chroniclers, illuminate a truth that challenges conventional understandings of power, knowledge, and historical continuity. They remind us that the most enduring legacies are often maintained not through force or public recognition, but through vigilance, wisdom, and a commitment to preserving what is sacred. The Templars, long celebrated as warrior monks, were also, at their core, custodians of knowledge, spiritual, symbolic, and practical. While men wielded swords and commanded armies, women wielded influence in subtler ways, preserving symbols, guiding heirs, maintaining sacred texts, and protecting rituals from the prying eyes of authorities. This duality, public action and hidden stewardship, underscores the complementary roles that sustained the order's influence long after its formal dissolution. In many ways, women became the living archives of Templar history, safeguarding its essence when the external structures were under attack or dismantled entirely. Their efforts ensured that the Templar legacy was not only preserved but capable of adaptation, capable of influencing subsequent generations and shaping the spiritual and cultural currents of Europe. Throughout history, evidence of this hidden influence appears in unexpected forms. The careful curation of manuscripts, the subtle symbolism embedded in art and architecture, and the preservation of family and esoteric traditions across generations. Women acted as interpreters and guardians, ensuring that knowledge was transmitted responsibly and remained comprehensible only to those prepared to receive it. This stewardship required foresight, intelligence, and courage, as the survival of sacred knowledge depended on discretion and secrecy. Their influence was not immediate or overt, but enduring, forming a bridge between the medieval order and the modern world, between past rituals and contemporary spiritual practices, and between hidden history and public awareness. Even as the centuries advanced, Templar women continued to shape the cultural and intellectual landscape in ways that are only now being fully appreciated. In the Renaissance, they acted as patrons, educators, and curators, embedding symbols, preserving manuscripts, and guiding heirs to maintain continuity. In the 17th and 18th centuries, they preserved knowledge through private networks, oral traditions, and strategic marriages. In the 20th century, they ensured that Templar legacies persisted in scholarship, esoteric societies, and cultural memory. Across all these periods, their influence demonstrates a continuity of purpose: to preserve, protect, and transmit knowledge that was deemed sacred, powerful, or dangerous. The hidden networks maintained by these women often operated outside the official record, relying on trust, discretion, and strategic foresight. Many were connected through family, social, or spiritual bonds, forming a web of custodianship that allowed the Templar heritage to survive the centuries-long pressures of persecution and cultural change. Through mentorship, curation, and careful stewardship, they ensured that the esoteric knowledge, symbolic language, and sacred traditions associated with the order were not lost to time. Their work, though largely unacknowledged by mainstream history, demonstrates the resilience of human agency in preserving what is most valuable when public institutions fail. Symbolism played a crucial role in this continuity, acting as both protective measure and communicative medium. Geometric patterns, coded inscriptions, heraldic motifs, and ritual objects were often curated and preserved by women who understood their meaning and importance. In doing so, they created a visual and intellectual language that transcended generations, allowing knowledge to survive in a form resistant to persecution, censorship, and cultural erasure. These symbols, subtle yet enduring, are the fingerprints of women who acted as guardians of secret tradition, ensuring that its lessons and power remained intact, accessible only to those capable of understanding them. The modern implications of this legacy are profound. In contemporary scholarship, cultural production, and esoteric practice, the influence of Templar women can be traced in unexpected ways. In the preservation of texts, the interpretation of symbols, the teaching of ritual, and the continuation of hidden networks. Their agency demonstrates that the most powerful forms of influence are not always the most visible. By preserving knowledge quietly and strategically, these women ensured that the Templar legacy remained alive, capable of inspiring discovery, reflection, and inquiry centuries after the Order's apparent disappearance. This enduring influence also reframes our understanding of history itself.